Czechoslovakia, a young, proud democracy armed with one of Europe's best militaries, simply gave in. So why didn't they fight? Why did a nation that could have resisted Hitler's early expansion decide instead to surrender without a struggle? Today, we'll uncover the real reason Czechoslovakia didn't resist Hitler in 1938, a story of betrayal, politics, fear, and the cold calculations of survival. To understand why Czechoslovakia didn't fight, we must go back 20 years earlier, to the end of the First World War. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918, it left behind a patchwork of ethnic groups and former imperial territories. Out of this chaos, a new nation emerged, Czechoslovakia. It combined the historic Czech lands of Bohemia and Moravia with Slovakia and Ruthenia to the east. It was democratic, industrially advanced, and led by men like Tomáš Masaryk and Edvard Beneš, who dreamed of building a modern Western-style state in Central Europe. But there was a problem. Within this new country's borders lived more than 3 million ethnic Germans, mostly in the mountainous border region known as the Sudetenland. These people had been part of the old empire's ruling class, educated, industrial, and proud of their German identity. Now, overnight, they found themselves minorities under a government dominated by Czechs and Slovaks. From day one, many of them wanted nothing to do with this new republic. The term Sudeten Germans originally described the German-speaking communities living along the Sudeten Mountains, the natural frontier with Germany and Austria. But politically, the Sudetenland came to mean all German-majority regions inside Czechoslovakia. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, the Sudeten Germans tried to declare their own small republics, hoping to join Austria or Germany. The Allies ignored them, and the new Czech army marched in to establish control. The resentment began immediately. In 1919, Czech troops fired on German demonstrators in the town of Kadaň, killing over 50 people. To the Sudeten Germans, this was proof that their new rulers didn't respect them. For the next 2 decades, the Sudeten question festered. Czechoslovakia tried to be fair. German was recognized as an official language. German schools were funded, and German parties participated in parliament. But to the Sudeten Germans it didn't matter. They had lost their privileges, their empire, and their political power. Meanwhile, Czech and Slovak politicians dominated the government, passing land reforms that confiscated estates from old German elites. Factories that once belonged to German industrialists were nationalized or given to Czech owners. For many Sudeten Germans, it felt like humiliation, and yet through the 1920s the country remained stable. While coups and dictatorships swept across Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia stood as the lone democracy in the region. But stability can hide fragility. By the late 1920s, the economy of Czechoslovakia was booming, but unevenly. The industrial heartlands in the Sudetenland were heavily dependent on exports, and when the Great Depression hit in 1929, they were the first to collapse. Sudeten towns saw unemployment skyrocket. By 1930, nearly half of all jobless workers in Czechoslovakia were German. The Czech-controlled government tried to respond with aid and programs, but it was never enough. To many Sudeten Germans, this was more proof that Prague favored Czechs over Germans. Out of this growing bitterness rose a new political force, the Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein. Henlein was a charismatic gymnastics instructor turned politician, and he knew exactly how to channel his people's anger. Publicly, he claimed to want only autonomy for Sudeten Germans. Privately, he coordinated with Hitler's government and dreamed of uniting with the Reich. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he promised to reunite all Germans, wherever they lived. To Sudeten ears, that was the sound of destiny calling. Czechoslovakia was everything Hitler hated: democratic, multi-ethnic, and allied with France. He viewed it as an obstacle standing in Germany's way to dominate Central Europe. In his speeches, he began denouncing the alleged mistreatment of Sudeten Germans, portraying them as victims of Czech oppression. At the same time, he started rearming Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. By the mid-1930s, German power was growing rapidly, and the balance of fear in Europe was shifting. Czechoslovakia's leaders could see the danger. In 1935, they even signed a defensive pact with the Soviet Union, but the fine print said that the Soviets would only help if France acted first. And that was the problem. France was Czechoslovakia's main ally, but by the late 1930s, French politics had turned pacifist and fearful. Nobody wanted another world war. Still, Czechoslovakia tried to prepare. It built an extensive system of fortifications along its borders, concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and machine gun nests modeled after France's Maginot Line. By 1938, the Czechs had one of the best-equipped militaries in Europe. On paper, they could resist Germany, but in politics, they stood alone. On March 12, 1938, German troops marched into Austria. The operation was swift, bloodless, and wildly popular among Austrians. Crowds cheered as Hitler's car rolled through Vienna. The world watched and did nothing. France and Britain protested, but they would not go to war over Austria. For Czechoslovakia, this was terrifying. The Anschluss now placed German troops directly on their southern border. The country was surrounded, Germany to the west and north, Austria, now German, to the south, and Hungary, a historical rival, to the east. If war came, France would have no way to reach them. The Soviets were too far. Czechoslovakia was isolated. Still, its government refused to bow. President Edvard Beneš believed that France and Britain would not abandon a democracy to fascist aggression. He was wrong. After Austria's annexation, Hitler decided that Czechoslovakia would be next. He summoned Sudeten leader Konrad Henlein to Berlin in late March and instructed him, "We must always demand so much that we can never be satisfied." Henlein returned home and issued a list of extreme demands to Prague. Full self-government for the Sudetenland, racial separation between Germans and Czechs, and compensation for supposed discrimination. These demands were designed to be rejected. The moment Prague said no, Hitler could claim the Germans were being persecuted, the perfect excuse for intervention. The Sudeten German party mobilized. Its paramilitaries staged riots and violent clashes with police. Nazi propaganda films exaggerated every confrontation, portraying Czechs as brutal oppressors. Europe began to fear that war was imminent. On September 12, 1938, Hitler delivered a fiery speech at the Nuremberg rally, accusing Czechoslovakia of trying to exterminate the Sudeten Germans. Across the border, Sudeten militants rose in open revolt. Czechoslovak troops moved in to restore order. Dozens died in firefights and bomb attacks. To the outside world, it looked like civil war, exactly what Hitler wanted. As Europe teetered on the edge, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to intervene personally. He flew to Germany to meet Hitler, hoping to prevent another world war. Chamberlain asked Hitler what he wanted. Hitler replied, "Only the Sudetenland, nothing more." Chamberlain believed him. When he returned to London, he persuaded France to agree. If the Sudeten Germans truly wanted to join Germany, why should Europe go to war to stop them? To Chamberlain and Daladier, giving Hitler what he wanted seemed like a small price for peace. In late September, Hitler issued an ultimatum. Czechoslovakia must hand over the Sudetenland by September 28th, or face invasion. The world held its breath. Across Europe, armies began to mobilize. War seemed hours away. Then, at the last moment, Mussolini proposed a conference to solve the crisis peacefully. Hitler agreed. On September 29, 1938, the leaders of Germany, Italy, Britain, and France met in Munich. The Czechoslovaks were not invited. In a single night, their allies gave away their borderlands. France, bound by treaty to defend Czechoslovakia, refused to act. Britain, desperate to avoid war, pushed Beneš to accept. When the deal was announced, Chamberlain famously waved the signed paper upon returning to London and declared, "Peace for our time." For Czechoslovakia, it was peace without honor, and peace without survival. So here's the key question. Why didn't Czechoslovakia resist? It wasn't because they lacked courage or weapons. Their army numbered over 1 million men, with modern tanks, aircraft, and some of Europe's best fortifications. But strategy is about more than guns. When the Munich Agreement was signed, Czechoslovakia faced impossible odds. Its western and southern borders were surrounded by German forces. Hungary and Poland were eyeing their own slices of territory. France and Britain, its supposed allies, had refused to help. The Soviet Union would not act unless France did first. If Czechoslovakia fought, it would fight alone. Its industrial zones, military fortifications, and defenses were all in the Sudetenland, the very region being surrendered. Once those borderlands were handed over, the rest of the country would be indefensible. To resist meant suicide. To comply meant humiliation. President Benes chose survival, at least for the moment. He resigned soon after, exiled to London, his country dismembered by foreign hands. As German troops marched into the Sudetenland in early October 1938, they were greeted with flowers and Nazi flags. Many Sudeten Germans celebrated what they saw as liberation. To the Czechs, it was a national nightmare. The loss of the Sudetenland meant the loss of 70% of Czechoslovakia's iron and steel, and most of its fortifications. Its borders were now wide open. In the months that followed, the fragile state began to crumble. Slovak nationalists demanded autonomy. Hungary and Poland seized small border territories. Then, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise. German troops marched into Prague and occupied what was left of the Czech lands. Slovakia was turned into a puppet state. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. The Munich Agreement, once hailed as a victory for peace, was exposed as a symbol of appeasement and betrayal. Even Chamberlain would later admit, it is peace only for today. So what was the real reason Czechoslovakia didn't resist Hitler? It wasn't cowardice. It was isolation. The nation was trapped between powerful enemies and abandoned by supposed friends. Its allies refused to honor their treaties, its borders were indefensible, and its population was deeply divided along ethnic lines. Even within Czechoslovakia, millions of Sudeten Germans wanted to join Germany. The government couldn't wage a war to keep people who no longer wanted to belong. And while the Czechoslovak army was strong, its leadership knew that fighting alone against Hitler, at a time when France and Britain were standing aside, would only lead to destruction. So they surrendered the Sudetenland in hopes of saving the rest. But Hitler's ambitions were never limited to the borderlands. He wanted the whole of Czechoslovakia, and eventually all of Europe. In the end, giving in only delayed the inevitable. The fall of Czechoslovakia was a preview of what the world would face less than a year later, when German tanks rolled into Poland and the Second World War began. History would remember Munich as one of the darkest examples of appeasement. The idea that conceding to an aggressor could preserve peace proved disastrously wrong. But for Czechoslovakia, Munich was more than a diplomatic failure. It was a national tragedy. A nation built on democracy and industry, betrayed by its allies, and dismantled piece by piece without firing a single shot. When war finally broke out in 1939, many Czechs joined the Allied armies in exile, determined to reclaim their homeland. Their fight would continue in Britain, in France, and later on the Eastern Front. And when the war finally ended in 1945, Czechoslovakia rose again, scarred, divided, but free. Epilogue. We were left alone. In his memoirs, President Benes reflected on 1938 with haunting words. We were left alone. We were betrayed not only by our enemies, but by those who called themselves our friends. The tragedy of Czechoslovakia in 1938 wasn't that it refused to fight. It's that it was forced to choose between certain death and temporary survival. In that choice lies the real reason Czechoslovakia didn't resist Hitler. Not weakness, not fear, but the desperate realization that the rest of the world had already surrendered, long before they ever did. Thanks for watching. If you found this story of diplomacy, betrayal, and survival fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know which forgotten chapter of history you'd like us to explore next.